Welcome back to the How to Japanese podcast. This is the Murakami Haruki season. This is the third installment of looking at Murakami's complete bibliography, and today we'll be looking at that from 2006 to 2023. You can follow along at bit.ly/Murakami bibliography. I've created a Google Sheet where you can see all of Murakami's publication information in a more detailed format. So from 2006 to 2023, Murakami goes to a new level of fame. He becomes regularly spoken about as a candidate and at times even a kind of presumed future winner of the Nobel Prize. There's even a semi-governmental organization in Japan that holds a conference to kind of promote his candidacy almost. They gathered together a bunch of his translators, I think in 2006. Although the Nobel talk, I would say, peaked in the late 2000s and has died down more recently. We start to see the simultaneous publication of works in magazines like The New Yorker and in Japan, or as close to simultaneous as you can get. He starts to win international literary awards regularly and make speeches, and he's much more active and open outside of the literary world where he's been productive in Japan. He also starts up an actual Murakami radio show, partnering with famous radio hosts and actors, some of whom read his works out loud. And he opens a library on Waseda's campus that's designed by architect Kengo Kuma and will house his archives. One final thing to note before I get started is that Osakabe Yoshio's complete list of Murakami's publications, one of the main resources I've been using for this project, stops in 2009. So everything after that has been my own personal research. So if anything isn't included or if I missed something, please do let me know. You can reach me at howtojapanese@gmail.com. In 2006, Murakami publishes 2 works of nonfiction, 2 translations, and 1 story collection. On March 30th, he publishes This I Have to Ask Murakami-san. The public bombards Murakami-san with 330 questions for now. Can he answer them? And the Japanese is another one of these very long, ridiculous titles. これだけは村上さんに言っておこうと世間の人々が村上春樹にとりあえずぶつける330の質問に果たして村上さんはちゃんと答えられるのか? This is another set of questions from readers. It's a sequel to the volume he published in 2000. These are also taken from his website that was online from June 96 to November 99. And overlaps with some of the content that was on both of the CDs that he previously put out. The collection's illustrated by Anzai Mizumaru, and one notable thing is that it includes questions from readers in Taiwan and Korea that are only included in this volume. Murakami's always had a pretty substantial readership in Asia, and I think this is probably a reflection of that. This is, I think, probably the first time that he's taking questions in this online format from readers outside of Japan. And the first area that he goes to is in Asia. On November 10th, Murakami publishes a translation of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and that Japanese title is Great Gatsby. Again, Murakami's going for katakana for the title rather than translating the meaning into Japanese. Murakami notes that he wanted to start translating this novel by the time he was 60, but ended up not being able to wait quite that long. He's born in 49, so I think that makes him 57 at this point. Fitzgerald is obviously a very meaningful writer for him, and he's been reading The Great Gatsby since he was in high school, so he says he was almost a little bit scared to start. But that he had an idea of how he wanted to translate this novel for a long time and just needed the English ability and the translation skills to be able to pull it off. So in addition to Carver, Fitzgerald's the writer that Murakami's been translating the longest since 1979, so over 35 years. After Hear the Wind Sing, the next thing he puts out is a Fitzgerald translation. So he's come full circle, and it took him a while to get here, but he gets to Fitzgerald's great novel. On November 30th, Murakami puts out another set of his exchanges with readers. This one is titled, Should We Have Murakami-san Do This? The public bombards Murakami-san with 490 questions for now. Can he answer them? And that Japanese title is, Hitotsu Murakami-san de yatte miru ka to seken no hitobito ga Murakami Haruki ni toriaezu butsukeru 490の質問に果たして村上さんはちゃんと答えられるのか? So with the release of the previous book of questions earlier this year in March 2006, Murakami opened up his website again for 3 months and took questions from readers until June. This book publishes 490 of the 832 reader exchanges that were published on that website. So clearly this is a format that he is going back to again and again, and we'll see again from him moving forward, even closer to the present day. On December 10th, Murakami publishes Murakami Haruki for Beginners, Hajimete no Bungaku Murakami Haruki. This is a volume in Bungei Shunju's Literature for Beginners series. It includes the following stories: Sydney Greenstreet, A Perfect Day for Kangaroos, Mirror, Rise and Fall of Sharpie Cakes, Dab Chick, Dancing Dwarf. There's a bunch of stories from Yoru no Kumozaru, which is The Spider Monkey Comes at Midnight, and they have not been translated. The Little Green Monster, The Silence, and Super Frog Saves Tokyo. This is a bit of a best of with several stories that are overlapping with the Elephant Vanishes collection. They're all selected by Murakami. The text was printed in slightly larger font with more furigana reading notes than usual for younger readers. And on December 16th, Murakami puts out a translation of Chris Van Allsburg's Probuditi! Exclamation point. I don't know what that means, but the Japanese translation is Sa inu ni narunda. So I assume it has something to do with the magician. This is another illustrated book by Van Allsburg that's published in 2006. So this is Murakami publishing translation simultaneously with Van Allsburg's publication in English. And there are two other things worth noting about 2006. In 2006, the publisher Chuo Koronsha starts to put out a complete bunko, a small format version of all of Murakami's translations of Carver, Fitzgerald, C.D.B. Bryant, Paul Thoreau, John Irving, Mark Strand, Sam Halpert, and I think that's just about everybody. There might be a few others. The set has a total design by Wada Makoto, and kind of completes Murakami's goal of having all of his books look nice together on a shelf in a really nice format. The other thing worth noting is that Murakami wins a number of prizes this year. I don't think I'll talk about every prize he wins, but 2006 is notable because he gets the Franz Kafka Prize, the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award, and the World Fantasy Award. The World Fantasy Award is for the translation of Kafka on the Shore. And this kind of kicks the Nobel Prize talk up to another level. In particular, the Franz Kafka Award, because Harold Pinter had won the prize, the Franz Kafka Award, the year before in 2005, and went on to win the Nobel. In 2007, Murakami publishes 1.5 translations, 1 work of short fiction and 1.5 works of nonfiction, and you'll see how I get to those numbers in just a second. On March 10th, 2007, he publishes the translation of The Long Goodbye by Raymond Chandler, and that title in Japanese is Long Goodbye. Murakami talks at length about Chandler's effect on his writing in his book on translation. He attributes the developments he made in A Wild Sheep Chase to Chandler, and even calls that writing style junbungakuteki, so more literary in nature. But then after that, he says that he ended up shifting to different styles. For Horrible Wonderland, that was kind of fantastical. For Norwegian Wood, that was realism. And then finally to, again, this word comprehensive is the word he uses. A comprehensive overall style in The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle and Kafka on the Shore, kind of his own style there. But he says that Chandler was his starting point and that it was nostalgic to revisit while he was working on this translation. On March 29th, Murakami publishes a set of short fiction called Murakami Karuta, French Who Love Rabbit. That's Murakami Karuta, Usagi Oishii Fransujin. This is another syllabary exercise. So karuta are the Japanese card game that gets played where you read, I think, the first half of a poem, and then you have to you compete against somebody, and you have to slap the card with the rest of the poem on it. So he creates a short little poem or phrase. There's an associated illustration by Anzai Mizumaru, and then there's a short piece of fiction. They're very bizarre little pieces, very much along the same lines as the things from The Spider Monkey Comes at Night, Kangaru Byori, even shorter than those, though, the Perfect Day for Kangaroos, much closer to Yoru no Kumozaru. And The obi on the cover of the book says, Murakami-san, こんなことをしてていいんですか? So is it really okay that you're writing something like this? Just flipping through it, I see a couple of like butt and fart jokes. So he's clearly just kind of having fun with this. The second half of the book, once he gets through all the syllables, is kind of more of the same, more short writing, and then yonkoma manga from Anzai Mizumaru. So again, Murakami in a constant state of productivity, writing something. On October 15th, Murakami publishes the memoir What I Talk About When I Talk About Running, Hashiru koto ni tsuite kataru toki ni boku no kataru koto. This is a nonfiction memoir about his relationship with running. It's been really widely translated, so I assume a lot of you have maybe read some of it, if not all of it. It includes some writing from his time in Europe that I think he went on to edit. And it's good. It's not a bad little book. I mean, it ties in a lot with his kind of theory on writing too, which is hard work and dedication will get you through the pain. Pain is optional. This is also an interesting piece of writing to me because this is where Murakami admits that when he submitted Hear the Wind Sing, the manuscript for Hear the Wind Sing, he submitted the only copy of the work he had. And that always amazes me because it feels like it could very easily have gotten lost, or if he didn't win, maybe not returned or something like that, and then just disappeared completely. I also think it's interesting that he chose to have this translated and not his other nonfiction, and kind of, I think, confirms my suspicions that Murakami is the limiting factor here. I mean, this is judging only based on my perception of Murakami's persona, but it does seem like running would be something that he'd be excited to share with foreign readers, and not only running, but also through running, his theory on writing, as opposed to, his experiences traveling in Europe in the 80s, which maybe he wouldn't build that Murakami persona in the same way, and so maybe he thinks that it wouldn't be quite as interesting, which I don't think is the case at all. I think his travel writing is great and that it deserves to be translated. And on December 10th, Murakami publishes Murakami Songs, and that's straight up the Japanese title as well, Murakami Songs. This is the one work that I think counts as half a translation and half a work of nonfiction. He translated song lyrics and then wrote an essay for each song. Wada Makoto did illustrations. The songs include The Beach Boys' God Only Knows, Billie Holiday, God Bless the Child, All I Want to Do by Sheryl Crow, and others. He says that his personal favorite song is Loneliness is a Well by Anita O'Day. And he says that he calls projects like this, the kind of writing he does here, invigorating. So I think it's another example of Murakami giving himself a project, something to do, starting with that idea in mind and then writing to it. In 2008, Murakami publishes 3 translations. The first comes on February 25th. It's a translation of Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. The Japanese title is Tiffany de Choshoku. Murakami says this is another personal favorite of his, although he's confused by the way it ends. He says that it kind of distances itself from the urban fairy tale style that Capote created. He says that he always wanted to translate it and finally heeded the call and enjoyed doing so. In his book on translation, Murakami also mentions the movie and very subtly says that the content is quite different from the book and asks readers to distance themselves from it while reading. And I think we can all imagine why that might be the case. That same day, he publishes another translation. This is February 25th. It's a book called The Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, 33 1/3 by Jim Fusili. This is from a series of books about albums, and the series is called 33 1/3, and this one's about the Beach Boys album. Murakami's a huge Beach Boys fan. He was 17 when Pet Sounds came out, and California Girls in particular features and Hear the Wind Sing, his first novel. In his book on translation, Murakami mentions that he thinks Pet Sounds is deeper than Sgt. Pepper, but that Pet Sounds also took him longer to understand. And he says that he doesn't listen to Sgt. Pepper as much now, but he does listen to Pet Sounds, which is, I think, really interesting, especially given that he basically credits Sgt. Pepper in the afterword to Norwegian Wood and says how much he listened to it while writing that novel. On November 28th, Murakami publishes a book called Murakami Haruki Hybrid. That Japanese title is basically the same, Murakami Haruki Hyburido. This is a bilingual collection of translated American short stories with a CD of the stories being read by the authors. I need to confirm details about this. I don't know too much about it, but it was published by Aruku, a language publisher. It's pronounced Aruku, but it's ALC is the way it's spelled. The project was organized by translator Shibata Motoyuki, and the stories included are On the Rainy River by Tim O'Brien, A Small Good Thing by Raymond Carver, and Lederhosen by Murakami. Moving on to 2009, Murakami publishes another 3 translations, a novel, and 1 collection of short fiction. And actually, before he publishes anything this year, in February, he wins the Jerusalem Prize, an award given to writers whose work deals with themes of human freedom, society, and politics. Accepting the award, he gives a very famous speech, and the quote from that speech that has really lived on, I think, is, "Between a high, solid wall and an egg that breaks against it, I will always stand on the side of the egg." Murakami has apparently noted that the speech was translated by Jay Rubin, and I'll post a link to it in the blog. On March 1st, Murakami publishes a book titled Watashi Tachi no Rinjin Raymond Carver, Our Neighbor Raymond Carver, and it's a collection of short memoirs about Raymond Carver, and Murakami's comments about the book make it sound like it's not a complete translation of any one single book from English, but rather a set of various different pieces that he selected by writers such as Tobias Wolff and others, and the editor Gary Fiskett-John. In Murakami's book on translation, there is an image included of the English book, Remembering Ray, a composite biography of Raymond Carver by William Stoll and Maureen Carroll. So I think that's along the lines of what this is, and maybe even includes parts of that in translation. On April 15th, Murakami publishes a translation of Farewell My Lovely by Raymond Chandler. The Japanese title is Sayonara Itoshi Hito. This is the second Philip Marlowe book and Murakami's personal favorite. He mentions loving the rhythm of the sentences. On May 30th, Murakami releases books 1 and 2 of 1Q84. This is one of Murakami's big, quote-unquote, composite novels that he's chasing after. It's another split narrative book. The 2 characters are Aomame and Tengo. Aomame is an assassin who becomes transported to another world as she climbs down an expressway stairwell and ends up in an alternate version of 1984. She's brought in to take out a cult leader, but finds that he's expecting her. Tengo is a kind of uninspiring writer, but a solid editor who's drafted to help Fukaeri, a young girl, win a prestigious literary prize. And when they win, the story draws the attention to the occult that her family grew up in. This book was a total PR success, although that wasn't an intentional PR strategy. As I mentioned in Kafka on the Shore, they released zero information about the book beforehand. And the reason why they did that was they talked to Murakami and they tried to do it as an experiment, because for Kafka, they had spent a year publicizing it, and readers complained that details about the story leaked before maybe not leaked, but were revealed before the publication. So in this case, they decided to just try and see how it went, and it went really well. The novel sold a ton of copies, although I think there's information out there saying that the book 1 sold more copies than book 2, so maybe people kind of got tired in that first book and didn't read all the way through. The book does spin its wheels a good bit, and Murakami traps his protagonist in a lot of ways. Fukaeri is kind of questionably depicted as a kind of a vehicle for Tengo, and it does feel like he's trying to recreate the magic of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, and ends up just kind of recounting history rather than dramatizing it like he did on a micro level in the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. On November 25th, Murakami publishes a translation of Winter Dreams by F. Scott Fitzgerald. The title is Fuyu no Yume in Japanese. This is an original selection of Fitzgerald's stories by Murakami. He says it's the ones that he thought that Japanese readers would like. And he notes that his favorite of Fitzgerald's stories might be either Winter Dreams, Rich Boy, or Babylon Revisited. Any one of those 3, he says, would be a great favorite Fitzgerald story. 2 days later, on November 27th, Murakami publishes Blind Willow Sleeping Woman, Mekura Yanagi to Nemuru Onna. This is a Japanese version of the 2006 English collection that was an anthology of a ton of different Murakami stories from across his career. The Japanese version has the same order as the English version for all 24 stories that Murakami selected with the advice of Gary Fisketjon, and it includes 2 introductions from Murakami. So this is a lot like the Elephant Vanishes project. This is Murakami being re-imported to Japan, showing Japanese readers how he's being received abroad to a certain extent. And looking through the stories listed in this collection, it just kind of reminds me that the story Crabs from this collection is taken in part from the story Baseball Field, which is an unpublished story from Dead Heat on a Merry-Go-Round. So yeah, interesting to read that story from Baseball Field, which basically it has a story within a story, and Murakami extracts that and publishes it as Crabs in this Blind Willow Sleeping Woman collection. In 2010, Murakami publishes 1 novel, 3 works of translation for the 3rd year in a row, 3 works of translation, and 1 work of nonfiction. On March 1st, 2010, he publishes the translation of Beginners by Raymond Carver. That Japanese title is Beginners. This is the unedited version of the stories in what we talk about when we talk about love. So the stories unedited by Gordon Lish that Raymond Carver wrote. Murakami, in his book on translation, notes that he thinks the original longer versions are going to be the ones that live on and are better known. So that's interesting to note. Maybe that's not a surprise coming from somebody who's written 2 1,800-page novels in the last 15 years. Speaking of which, on April 16th, Murakami puts out book 3 of 1Q84. I was living in Japan when this came out, and I think it just kind of came out with a whimper, to be honest. The only things I remember from it are Ushikawa just sitting in the hotel room and then getting killed, Aomame reading Proust in an apartment, and then finally at the end meeting up with Tengo and them hanging out on the playground equipment as they reunite. That always kind of makes me think of Final Fantasy VII, the playground scene. The one last thing I think that should be mentioned with regards to 1Q84 Book 3 is Ushikawa and the links with the Wind Up Bird Chronicle. I think this is Murakami maybe less subtly riffing on his own material like he did in the past with like the Sheepman or things like that. Here, I think it's less artfully done, and it's Murakami more kind of creating something very suggestive in a way that will intrigue readers, but perhaps isn't quite thought out, in a way that makes it artful. Just looking through people talking about this on the internet, you find people saying, I am assuming there will be a book 4. Why are the little people making an air chrysalis with air threads and hair from Ushikawa? And I don't think there is an answer to that question. In Wind Up Bird Chronicle, Ushikawa is just there to move the plot along. He doesn't really play a role. And he plays more of a role in 1Q84, but I don't know. I don't see anything to it, to be honest. But I do see the connections with Murakami's past work and him trying to create something complex, comprehensive, but not really sticking the landing. On September 2nd, Murakami publishes a translation of The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein, and that title is Okinaki. In his book on translation, Murakami says that he knew about Shel Silverstein's book, The Missing Piece, but that he wasn't aware of The Giving Tree until he was asked to translate it, and he seems to recognize its reputation. It also sounds like he borrowed the same title as a previous translation of the book. On September 30th, Murakami publishes a book called I Wake Up Every Morning to Dream, Yume wa miru tame ni maiasa boku wa mezameru no desu. This is a collection of his interviews from 1997 to 2009. It would be a really great resource for anyone looking into Murakami's thoughts on specific books. It has a couple interviews about Sputnik Sweetheart, Kafka on the Shore, and 1Q84, along with other interviews focused on specific topics like translation. Again, this is showing Murakami continuing to create collected editions of various kinds of work and giving readers new volumes to buy and read. On November 30th, Murakami publishes a picture book version of his story Sleep, Nemuri. This is an illustrated version of the short story that was initially published in Germany in August 2009 with illustrations by Kat Menchik. And then Shinchosha brought this back to Japan. It's the first of a couple books that will get this treatment. And I think it shows, like Elephant Vanishes and Blind Willow Sleeping Woman, there's an interest in how Murakami is being read and interpreted abroad, and not just in English, in other languages and other countries as well. On December 1st, Murakami publishes a translation of The Little Sister by Raymond Chandler. That Japanese title is Ritoru Shista. Murakami says that this book wasn't well reviewed in English when it came out, but that he likes it. And this might be a kind of ironic comment, but he says that Chandler's weakness as a writer is that his female characters are flat and stereotypical compared to male characters. Murakami doesn't believe that's the case with this novel in particular. In 2011, Murakami publishes 3 works of nonfiction and 2 translations. He also wins the Catalonia International Prize and donates the winnings to victims of the March 11th earthquake. On January 31st, Murakami publishes Murakami Haruki Miscellany. That's Zatsubunshu is the title of this collection. It's a collection of different sorts of writing from a huge swath of his career, from 1980 all the way up until the 2000s. And one example is the piece about Dave Hilton that I read a part of in the episode about Murakami's origin. It also includes his speeches and not a speech, but written acceptance letters for awards and prizes, both speeches and written acceptance letters for awards and prizes he's won over the years, writing about different people like cover artist Chip Kidd, who does a lot of his English covers, and illustrator Anzai Mizumaru, he's got a close relationship with. Anzai Mizumaru passed away between the hardcover and paperback versions of this book, which Murakami notes in the Bunkobon, a little essay included with the Bunkobon version. Interestingly enough, this book also has a few outtakes from Yoru no Kumozaru, The Spider Monkey Comes at Night, a collection of very bizarre shorts. And one of those outtakes is titled Karatani Kojin, named after the famous Japanese critic. And Murakami says that his editor is like, you can't joke about this. Like, he uses Karatani Kojin in the story as a kind of element of wordplay. So if you're interested in that collection, that might be a good reason to pick this up. I would also just recommend it to Murakami nerds in general looking for a good read. Most of these pieces are very short, so you shouldn't be intimidated by the kind of chunky Bunkobon version. And I'd also recommend it for anyone like looking to get started reading Murakami. A lot of things to pick and choose from, and you don't have to read the whole thing. You can kind of find something that you're interested in and pick that out and read it. One final piece of trivia is that the cover includes art from both Wada Makoto and Anzai Mizumaru, so one of the few collections that includes 2 of Murakami's collaborators. On June 1st, Murakami publishes a translation of When We Talk About Raymond Carver, Watashi tachi ga Raymond Carver ni tsuite kataru koto. This is a collection of interviews of people who were close with Carver, and it also includes Carver translations by Murakami. I don't know too much about it other than that. On July 7th, Murakami publishes Big Stump, Difficult Avocado, Murakami Radio 2. That's Ookina Kabu, Muzukashii Avocado, Murakami Radio 2. I don't know if that translation is totally right. Whatever our interpretation of kabu is, stump or something like that. These are essays that were serialized in An at various points between 2009 and 2011 under the title Konshu no Murakami, Murakami This Week. It has illustrations by Ohashi Ayumi, and the topics are random as usual. 2 examples are examples of fiction that Murakami has thrown out, and Tojo Hideki's attempted suicide. On November 30th, Murakami publishes Absolutely on Music, Conversations with Seiji Ozawa. Japanese title is Ozawa Seiji-san to ongaku ni tsuite hanashi o suru. This collects 6 conversations recorded between Murakami and famous conductor Seiji Ozawa between November 2010 and July 2011. In the afterword, Ozawa notes that their wives were friends, which is how the two got to know each other. And in the 2013 edition, it included CDs for which Murakami wrote the liner notes. On September 30th, Murakami publishes a translation of But Beautiful, a book about jazz by Jeff Dyer. Japanese title is Batto Beautiful. This seems like right up Murakami's alley. Dyer wrote a kind of fictionalized look at jazz that combines elements of nonfiction and history with fiction as well. Moving on to 2012, Murakami publishes 2 translations and 1 work of nonfiction. On April 7th, he publishes a translation of Far North by Marcel Thoreau. The Japanese title is Kyokuhoku. Marcel Thoreau is the son of Paul Thoreau, whom Murakami translated back in 1987. Thoreau recommended his son's novel, and Murakami was surprised how much he enjoyed it, so he decided to translate it. I'm sure he must have also been partially motivated by the idea of translating a father and son duo. That's kind of cool. On July 9th, Murakami publishes a work of nonfiction called The Lion Who Loved Salad, Murakami Radio 3, Sarada Suki no Lion, Murakami Radio 3 or San. These are essays serialized in Anan and in magazine Ginza between 2011 and 2012. The topics are random again, like a lot of Murakami's essays. They include whether lions brush their teeth, T.S. Eliot's poem, The Naming of Cats is a Difficult Matter, and what Murakami brings to mind when he sees tomatoes. On December 1st, Murakami publishes a translation of The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. At this point, he makes a goal of translating all 7 of Chandler's novels, and he'll be the first translator to do this in Japan. In his book on translation, Murakami is a bit critical of the existing Futaba translation, which he says had a lot of holes in it. He does seem to recognize that there were different priorities at the time, that it was mostly the goal was to have people enjoy the work, whereas Murakami wants people also to enjoy the language. We made it to 2013, in which Murakami publishes 1 work of illustrated fiction, 1 novel, and 1 translation. On February 28th, he puts out The Bakery Attack, illustrated version of this. It's illustrated by Kat Minchik and was initially published in Germany in March 2012, the same illustrator as the last collection, the last story, Sleep. This includes both The Bakery Attack and the second Bakery Attack. And in the afterword, Murakami notes that the couple seem to be kind of stepping into the world of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle based on his impression, which I think is a kind of like astute reading, if that's what the illustrator meant to do. I think, again, this is the second in this series of illustrated books based on Murakami's fiction being imported back to Japan. On April 12th, Murakami publishes a novel, The Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage. Shikisai o motanai Tazaki tsukuru to kare no junrei no toshi. So in this book, Tazaki Tsukuru is effectively dumped by his close high school friends after he leaves Nagoya for Tokyo to study train station engineering in college. His friends all had Japanese words for colors in their names, so he always felt left out to a certain extent, and this new loss is an extension of that. He spends the next 18 years living with the scars of this separation, and at this point, his new love interest, Sarah, a travel agent, puts a halt to their relationship. She can tell he has baggage that he has to deal with before he can truly connect with someone. She helps him track down his friends and then kind of sets him off on an adventure to find them. The key points here are that this is completely in third person. Some people say it's his second after 1Q84, but if you include After Dark, it might be his third or so. It is probably his most successful with this technique. It's his most contained story that he's telling in third person that feels tied together and effective. It's a single volume rather than 3 volumes published in separate years, things like that. It's also straight realism for the most part. Obviously, there's going to be some unrealities in Murakami's straight realism, but there's no alternate universe. There's no mythologies that need to explain different characters, things like that. I think you could argue, a lot of people have argued that this is a post 311 story, kind of capturing that sense of loss after the earthquake and tsunami. In my review of the book, I said it was his best since Norwegian Wood, and I don't quite feel that same way. I think, as was shown in the power rankings, I think that other novels kind of hit higher points, like Sputnik Sweetheart, but it's still very good. And I think it's maybe arguably the most well told as a story, and self contained and crafted, that succeeds in a lot of ways that where Sputnik Sweetheart doesn't, although maybe isn't quite as inspired, I think. On September 7th, Murakami publishes 10 selected love stories, Koishikute. This is an anthology of love stories selected by Murakami and also translated by him. They include writers Jim Shepard, Richard Ford, Alice Munro, Tobias Wolff, and others. He says that he happened to read a few stories in the New Yorker and then had the desire to put them into a translation anthology, and that the stories all happened to be love stories. So then he had to go kind of track down a few others to meet that, to match that theme. He also says that Munro won the Nobel Prize shortly after the publication of this collection, and so he congratulates her in his book on translation. The 2016 Bunkobon version of this collection includes Samsa in Love, so it becomes more similar to that collection, Birthday Stories, that was the first anthology that Murakami put out. Moving on to 2014, Murakami publishes one story collection, 3 translations, and 1 work of illustrated fiction. On February 28th, his translation of Franny and Zoe by J.D. Salinger comes out, and the Japanese title is Franny to Zui. And I always thought it was Zoe, but I guess maybe it's Zui. It does have 2 O's. Murakami calls this the most difficult translation he's worked on to date. He's impressed with it on a technical level, with the types of sentences Zoe is using to try and convince Franny. He also sees Salinger as kind of reaching for something beyond Catcher in the Rye, recognizing that world from that novel is over. And Murakami said that putting that idea into Japanese was difficult. He was thrilled, though, to rediscover that writing like this existed. On April 18th, Murakami puts out a collection of short stories titled Men Without Women, Onna no Inai Otokotachi. That title is obviously taken from Hemingway, but in a very long introduction, Murakami notes that the title for the Japanese translation of Men Without Women, the Hemingway collection, is Otoko Dake no Sekai, which is a men's only world, which he thinks is a mistranslation. So in this long introduction, which is very strange for him, to be honest, he hasn't done anything like it before. He says that this phrase kind of came to him as he was writing Drive My Car, and that it became the kind of theme for the collection. He said that, he'd been mostly writing long works for a while, and then after writing Samsa in Love, kind of felt compelled to write short stories again after this long break. He also talks again about how his writing method with short stories, which is that he writes them in focused sets. I think, we kind of had that idea early in his career with some of those collections that felt very similar. A Slow Boat to China felt very different from Perfect Day for Kangaroos, and felt very different from a Spider Monkey. The Spider Monkey Comes at Night. And here he says that the Strange Tales from Tokyo Kitanshu, which was the 2005 collection, he wrote one of those every 2 weeks, which I think in the last episode, I think I mentioned that it was like one a month or something like that, or one a week. And so, yeah, he had a book ready to go in 3 to 4 months. And he felt like that gave, that focused writing of the stories gave them a consistency. And the same, it sounds like, was true here. He says that he doesn't have an explanation for the title, Men Without Women, that nothing like that has happened to him, other than maybe perhaps metaphorically it represents something about him, which to me feels a lot like A Poor Aunt's Story, and the way that phrase kind of takes over characters in that story. These are longer short stories. They're about 80 manuscript pages each, and they feel that way. They feel very long. And but Murakami does emphasize this kind of decisive nature of choosing to write this theme, spontaneous, decisive, just kind of doing it, which is has been his trademark, I think, a lot for most of his career. He also admits to making some changes. He changes the name of one city from Drive My Car. I think he got in trouble for saying that people from there couldn't drive or something like that. He also has to take out Beatles lyrics from the story Yesterday. One of the characters does like a Kansai dialect translation of the song Yesterday, and I guess he had to take that out or something, which seems a little bit silly, but I can't remember exactly what that was. Here he adds the title story at the end to kind of bring the collection together, he says, which is something that he'll do again, we'll see. I read this collection in Japanese when it first came out, and I think the most critical thing I can say about it is I don't really remember these stories that well. Looking back through them, they seem okay. They were fine, I thought. But there's one, an independent organ that didn't get an English translation, in which I think one of the characters accuses women of having an organ in their body that enables them to lie, which just seems like a very weird decision to make, and maybe explains why that one hasn't been translated. The names of the stories in the collection are Drive My Car, Yesterday, An Independent Organ, Scheherazade, I don't know if that pronunciation's right, but it's from Arabian Nights apparently, Kino, and Men Without Women. The English version also includes Samsa in Love, and I guess the one thing I might say is that the introduction might be more interesting than the stories here, to be honest. And then obviously Drive My Car went on to become a very successful movie. So on September 26, Murakami puts out a translation called Scenery of Thelonious Monk, Thelonious Monk no Ita Fuke. This is a collection of writing about Monk selected by Murakami. He was inspired to write the collection after meeting Lorraine Gordon, who was 93 years old at the time. She's since passed away. She was the owner of the Village Vanguard in New York City, and Murakami calls her a charming New Yorker. And Murakami ends 2014 with two translations. One is a kind of reverse translation. This is on November 27th. It's an illustrated version of Murakami's The Strange Library, Toshokan Kitan. Again, this is illustrated by artist Kat Minchik and was initially published in Germany. This one in August 2013. This is a third in a series of illustrated books based on Murakami's fiction. And then on December 5th, he publishes the translation of The High Window by Raymond Chandler. This also had two translations like several of the other Chandler novels, and Murakami complements the mystery plot and all of the kind of very typical detective novel secondary characters. In 2015, Murakami publishes 3 works of nonfiction and 1 translation. On April 9th, he publishes a translation of the Norwegian novel 11, Book 18 by Dag Solstad, and that title is just a katakana version of the English Novelle 11, Book 18. Murakami translated this from English. He used the English translation of this Norwegian novel and then translated it from English into Japanese. He discovered it at a bookstore at the Oslo airport in English translation and enjoyed reading it. The book is literally Solstad's 11th novel and 18th book. And Murakami says that if he hadn't translated it from English, it wouldn't have come into Japanese at all. This feels a little bit like an excuse, to be honest. I don't know if it would have been translated, but maybe not for the reasons Murakami thinks. I wonder if Murakami thinks that because it wasn't known or something like that, or because maybe he thinks that there aren't translators that could go from Norwegian to Japanese. I would say that maybe it doesn't recognize that Murakami there's no one that has the connections like Murakami does. Nobody has the time and the financial leeway to spend translating it, but perhaps there might be somebody who would be interested in translating it from Norwegian into Japanese. They just can't. On July 24th, Murakami publishes Murakami-san no Tokoro. Rough translation would be Murakami-san's Place. This is another website activity. That the website was online from January 15th to May 13th of 2015. The web address was wellyouneedn't.com, which is a reference to a Thelonious Monk song. He took questions for just over 2 weeks and received 37,465 questions and comments, and was able to personally read 32,550 of them. This is by far the most wide-reaching version of this online website activity that that he's done so far, and it shows that he's internationally famous now. The site is not online anymore, but you can access it via archive.org. It's difficult but not impossible to access that way. Check my blog for a link, and from there you can navigate to the top page. The book version includes 3,716 of the responses that Murakami was able to write. And this book was the first to be published digitally in Japan. And the digital version is a complete version, which I assume has more of the responses. I put up a blog post when this was happening. This was like the first time where it was happening. One of his websites was happening, and I was able to kind of read it and participate. I submitted a question. I don't think it got a response. I don't even remember what question it was. But my blog post got attention from all over the world, apparently. And so I have comments from people in Vietnam, Italy, Portugal, and Russia who left questions in their language. And unfortunately, they thought that my blog post was this Murakami website. The questions were random as always. For example, he mentions a nonfiction writing project that he hasn't started yet, but will require lots of preparation. I feel like maybe that's his project about his father. He says that he has an unpublished work he wrote for public reading, but hasn't had a chance to publish it yet. He says that the only way to become a writer in Japan is to win a new writers contest in a magazine. And he recommended Blood Meridian to a Japanese reader looking for more international literature. On September 10th, Murakami publishes Novelist as a Vocation, Shokugyo toshite no shousetsuka. This is a set of essays that were serialized in the magazine Monkey between October 2013 and June 2015, plus one from the magazine Kangaeru Hito, and then 5 new essays. Strangely enough, Kinokuniya bought 90% of the first edition, which was 100,000 copies, so I guess they bought 90,000 copies. They did this as a PR strategy to promote its move to online sales, and they supplied their own store with 30 to 40,000 of those copies and then sold the rest to other stores. I guess it worked. I don't know. I've used the Kinokuniya online store, and it's actually really good, so I can recommend it. You do have to order a certain amount to get free shipping. Otherwise, shipping is a little pricey, but the shipping was really good and quick, and I used it to buy both English language books and Japanese language books, so had a good experience with that. This book in particular I have not read, but it addresses how to gather material for writing prizes, his own experience becoming a writer, writing in schools, and going abroad. The Japan Times has a nice review of it that I've linked in the blog post. I didn't write the review, obviously. The review emphasizes Murakami's tendency to think of himself as nothing special, to kind of not stand out, which feels like a pose at times. He's been so successful. There must be something there, but he kind of projects himself as nobody of sorts, which is a very kind of cool pose, I guess. And on November 21st, Murakami publishes the nonfiction collection What the Hell is in Laos? Laos ni ittai nani ga aru to yun desu ka? This is a set of travel writing. These are essays that were published in magazines Tayo, Tidal, Agora, and Korea between 95 and 2016. There's one from 95, and the rest are more recent. The one in 95 is from about his time in Boston. The others are about traveling in Iceland, New England, Europe, New York, Vietnam, Italy, Kumamoto. There's some really nice essays in this collection. I've read a few of them. In particular, there's one about him revisiting Mykonos, where he started writing Norwegian Wood. It's excellent. I read a section of that essay in the very first episode of this Bibliography set of episodes, so go back and take a listen to that if you missed it. And I'll put a link in the blog to some of the blog posts where I was analyzing essays from that collection, so take a look at that. Now we're in 2016, in which Murakami puts out 2 translations. The first comes on March 27th. It's a translation of Carson McCullers' The Member of the Wedding, Kekkonshiki no Memba. Murakami said that he wanted to translate The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, but that it's so long that he wanted to start with this one first, and also that his wife is a fan of this book. He praises Carson McCullers' writing and says her description of people and setting is very smooth and sketch-like. This novel is also the start of the Murakami Shibata Honnyakudo, which I guess you could translate as Murakami Shibata House of Translation. It's a new series that is made up of both reissues of older translations and new translations of older authors to bring more attention to works that they think should be read. They started with this book and Shibata's translation of My Name is Aram by William Saroyan. Other books in the set include novels such as Philip Roth's The Great American Novel. That's a reissue. Thomas Hardy's short stories, including The Withered Arm. Colin Wilson's The Space Vampire, and Maxine Hong Kingston's Chinaman. I'll post a link to this project. The website is still up. And on December 8th, Murakami publishes a translation of Playback by Raymond Chandler. The Japanese title is Playback. He says that Chandler is losing a little of his power later in his career, but it's still well written. And he claims that people, I guess by which he means readers, are only interested in how he translated the famous line, "If I wasn't hard, I wouldn't be alive. If I couldn't ever be gentle, I wouldn't deserve to be alive." And unfortunately, he doesn't share what that translation is in his book on translation, so I can't tell you what that is. In 2017, Murakami writes 1 novel, 2 works of nonfiction, and 3 works of translation. On February 24th, Murakami publishes the novel Killing Commendatore in 2 volumes, Part 1, The Idea Made Visible, and Part 2, The Shifting Metaphor. A quick summary is that an artist's wife leaves him, sending him into a tailspin. When he finally kind of recovers, he sets up in a house in rural Odawara for 9 months trying to reinvent his painting, and runs into all different sorts of characters, including an IT Baron Minsky who lives across the hill and seems to be spying on a girl, Akigawa Marie, who may or may not be his daughter. He finds a painting in the attic, and a commendatore from the painting jumps out of it and seems to have some kind of magical powers. Minsky and the narrator dig a hole and discover a bell at the bottom, and then the rest of the novel is kind of trying to discovering how all these characters are interrelated, including the artist who used to live in the house. As I mentioned in the power rankings, I feel like this novel has a much stronger start than 1Q84. It sets up stakes. It sets up a limited time period. But then Murakami falls into immediacy so easily, and we just get a standard depiction of an artist's kind of everyday. One interesting thing is that this faceless man in the introduction is a kind of figure that's appeared in his work before, namely in The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, although even there the faceless figure isn't fleshed out quite so much. Here, they don't seem to be quite as directly interrelated as Ushikawa is in 1Q84 and The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, but I do think it does show Murakami kind of playing with similar themes. Speaking of which, he does create another world here in this book. He's not alternating chapters, but he creates this other world where the narrator goes to that feels almost like an oversimplified end of the world, a kind of metaphorical reality, but it comes too late, and it's just not successful, I don't think. We do have some publication details from an interview with the author Kawakami Mieko. We know that he started writing at the end of July 2015, and he finished the first draft about 9 months later in early May of 2016. And then he spent the next 4 months rewriting and eventually got to a 5th draft, apparently. And that was the finalized version that he gave to publishers. So Murakami editing this one, but again, not one of his strongest works. On March 18th, Murakami puts out a book called Murakami Haruki's Almost Complete Translation Work. The Japanese is Murakami Haruki Honyaku Hotondo Zen Shigoto. And this is the book that I've been referencing quite a lot throughout this bibliography project. It's a nice glossy paperback book with photos of all the works that Murakami has translated, cover art for all the books, Japanese version and their English version, up until 2017, along with comments from Murakami. It also has a taidan with Shibata Motoyuki, the translator, and it has a translation by Murakami that he did in the 80s by Otis Ferguson of Stompin' at the Savoy. And in the Taidan, it's pretty interesting. I haven't read the whole thing, but I flipped through it, and Murakami calls Shibata his equivalent of university because he helped him so much with his translation and did a lot of checking and supporting of him early on as a translator. This is a must read for anyone studying Murakami's translations. It's super interesting. It's also just a really nice book to look at. It really helps emphasize exactly how much translation work Murakami has done. The quantity is massive. On April 7th, there's a publication of The Owl Spreads Its Wings with the Falling of the Dusk. The Japanese title is Mimizuku wa Tasogare ni Tobitatsu. This is a set of Taidan conversations with the author Kawakami Mieko. I mentioned it above briefly because it has information about the publication schedule for, I guess, Killing Commendatore, or what was it? Yeah, Killing Commendatore. And the title quote comes from Kawakami's introduction, and she said that the one thing Murakami said over and over was that the important thing was to spend a great deal of time with the project and to be able to ascertain when a moment is taking place. And she compares that to the owl of Athena or the owl of Minerva, and metaphorically says, the owl of Minerva of a story will spread its wings only with the falling of the dusk. This is kind of playing on a quote from Hegel's preface to the Philosophy of Right. And he says, he's basically saying that philosophy only captures reality after reality has matured, rather than philosophy influencing reality. So he's basically trying to say philosophy can't teach the world what it ought to be, in his words. And this moment of the owl of Minerva spreading its wings is when philosophy kind of captures reality, I guess. So a little bit taken out of context, but a nice thought that she's captured in her insight from Murakami. It collects 4 conversations between the two, between July 2015 and February 2017. The first of these conversations was originally published in a 2015 issue of Monkey to commemorate the publication of Novelist as a Vocation. And the collection starts with Kawakami recollecting her attendance of one of Murakami's post-Kobe earthquake readings. He did not often do public readings and signings or anything like that, but he did one after the Kobe earthquake, given his connection there as his hometown, very close to Kobe. And there he did a reading at the Kobe Motomachi Kaikan in 1995 in September. It went over 2 days, and she attended both days apparently. So that's a kind of amazing little connection. And then she went on to become an extremely well-known writer herself and very successful. Part of this was translated in 2020 for LitHub, and I'll post that link in the blog with the title A Feminist Critique of Murakami Novels with Murakami Himself. And it's a really fascinating conversation, and Kawakami really presses him on his depiction of women in his novels. And he pushes back a little bit, and she continues to push. And it's really interesting, partially because Murakami gets in depth about specific textual questions and characters and things like that, which sometimes he avoids completely by just saying, oh, I don't remember my novels. I don't reread them after I've written them and things like that. This is the first time I've seen him answer something so specifically. She goes on to compliment Sleep and Murakami's portrayal of women there, but kind of is overall critical of women being forced to fight in reality while men are doing work in the subconscious in Murakami novels, kind of for their own self-realization. The translation feels like it's kind of taken a little bit out of context, but is still really fascinating in terms of the way it's presented. The way the material is presented is very different from the way the material is presented in Japanese, and it did make a big impression when it was published. But that said, I think it's really fascinating and worth a read. So definitely check out that link. On April 28th, Murakami publishes a translation of The Sterile Cuckoo by John Nichols. That translation is Tamago wo umenai kakko. Nichols wrote this book in 1964, 1965 about college life, and it includes a depiction of the protagonist's kind of eccentric love interest. which makes it sound a bit like Norwegian wood. Murakami says he read it in college when he was around 20 or so, and that when translating it, he had trouble with some of the generational slang and had to ask Ted Goosen, but even he didn't know. He said that generation drank, but the next generation smoked pot, so they used much different language. This is the last translation that Murakami mentions in his translation book, so everything moving forward is just my own research. Unfortunately, it took a lot more time than having Murakami's own words, which is cool. This book was also included in the series that he started with Shibata. On August 31st, Murakami puts out the translation of Later the Same Day by Grace Paley. The Japanese title is Sonohi no Gokoku ni. This is his third Paley collection. The others were in 1999 and 2005, and now finally 2017. This is Paley's last collection, and it came out in 1985. It also includes essays and interviews that were serialized in Monkey. And I found a Japanese blogger with some comments about the afterword. Murakami makes it sound like it was a tough translation, but the blogger says that there's no sign of this in the translation, that it reads smoothly. And on December 6th, Murakami publishes the translation of The Lady in the Lake by Raymond Chandler. The Japanese title is Suite no Onna. This is his seventh and final translation of a Chandler novel. So now he's translated all 7 of Chandler's novels. This one was written in 1943 during World War II and written shortly after Pearl Harbor. So there are some references to the war in the book, apparently. In Murakami's commentary about the translation, he says that the book is missing the liveliness of Chandler's other novels, that the plot is loose, but that it's popular among fans. And a review from Sankei notes that Murakami combines the kind of conversational aspects of one previous translation with the rhythmic aspects of another previous translation into one. So it sounds quite successful. In 2018, Murakami publishes 3 translations from new authors. They're all in kind of similar veins to works that he's translated previously. But at this point, he's finished Chandler, Carver, Fitzgerald, also probably all the illustrated books from Van Allsburg. So he's starting to look for new authors. On January 27th, Murakami publishes a translation of Elmore Leonard's novel Ombre. In Japanese, that's Ombre. Elmore Leonard might seem like a somewhat natural transition after finishing Chandler, but this is actually one of his Western novels. It was published in 1961, and so maybe not the typical stuff, the stuff that's been had movies based on it more recently. Although this book does include 310 to Yuma, which had a movie made about it. I couldn't find too much about this other than the fact that a reviewer called it Hemingway-esque, muri mo nai, in terms of that's what the text felt like. On November 30th, Murakami publishes the translation of Enormous Radio / The Swimmer by John Cheever. Japanese title is Kyodai na Radio, Oyogu Hito. It includes some tie-down conversations with Shibata Motoyuki and essays. And I found information that Murakami said he's wanted to translate Cheever for a long time. To Murakami, he's part of this golden age of short story writing in the U.S. that includes Salinger, Cheever, Capote, and Flannery O'Connor. And on December 5th, Murakami publishes a translation of My Uncle's Donkey by Toby Riddle. The Japanese title is Watashi no Oji-san no Roba. This is from Toby Riddle, an Australian artist author, one of his illustrated books. Now it's 2019. Murakami publishes 2 translations and 1 book of nonfiction. The first comes on May 9th. It's a book of nonfiction called Let's Talk About Real Translation, Honto no Honnyaku no Hanashi o Shio. This is a collection of tie-down conversations with Shibata Motoyuki. They're talking about specific aspects of translation, like, for example, talking about Chandler's novel Playback. Murakami uses watashi, and they end up discussing about how Murakami ended up using watashi as the pronoun for the narrator in Killing Commendatore, which is interesting for Murakami because he usually goes with boku. They also discuss the English translation of other Japanese authors and Murakami himself. I found one reference to them recommending Cheever here, and they released an expanded edition a month later with Shinchosha. The original was published by Switch Publishing and has 6 different tie-down. So this is just another example of Murakami and Shibata's really close relationship and how uh, extremely productive they've been and contributing to translated literature in Japanese. On June 6th, Murakami publishes A Writer's Evening Hours, a collection of Fitzgerald's later works. The Japanese title is Arusaka no Yukoku Fitzgerald Koki Sakuhin Shu. This is an anthology of translations that even includes new translations for some of the very first Fitzgerald stories that Murakami translated. For example, An Alcoholic Case. The old translation was Alcohol no Naka, and the new title is Alcohol ni Oborete. These are just stories from later in Fitzgerald's career, and I found one review that made an interesting point that Murakami's translation might have been maturing a little bit. On August 27th, Murakami publishes a translation of Stan Getz, A Life in Jazz by Donald Magan. The Japanese title is Stan Getz Ongaku wo Ikiru. This is a biography of all the ups and downs in Stan Getz's life. I found one funny Amazon review that said, Tonikaku nagai, which I guess means that it's a pretty long book. This just shows more of Murakami's interest in jazz. 2020, Murakami publishes 2 works of nonfiction, one collection of stories, and 2 translations. Still crazy productive after all these years. On April 23rd, Murakami writes Abandoning a Cat, Talking About My Father. The Japanese title is Neko o Steru, Chichioya ni tsuite kataru toki. This was originally published in the June 2019 issue of Bunge Shunju magazine. Murakami writes about his father. The two had a bad relationship and were estranged for 20 years at one point, and he's largely avoided writing about family, even in his fiction. For example, we never really get a sense of Toru Okada's family, although we get a sense of Kumiko's family in great detail. And that's in The Wind Up Bird Chronicle. In Norwegian Wood, we don't have a good sense of Toru Watanabe's family. In Hear the Wind Sing, he's staying with his family, but they're just kind of illusory figures. He polishes his dad's shoes. Murakami at some point gets interested in looking into his father's war history, and I think started researching it in 2013, which was, I think, 5 years after his father's death, if my dates are right from the story. He had been under the impression that the division participated in the Nanjing massacre, and so I think had been hesitant to look into it in too much detail. But it turns out his father's timing was really fortunate. He joined after the massacre and then was discharged twice, the second time a month before Pearl Harbor. So it sounds like he avoided some of the worst of the war. It's a really good read. It's interesting to see Murakami write in so much detail. We learned that the father was one of 6 sons of a temple family and was sent to Nara initially to inherit that temple, but got sick and was sent home. He holds back slightly in terms of describing exactly what caused the rift with his father, but he mentions that it could have been that he married young and then started working in a jazz bar. So it could be connected to that a little bit. But it's really interesting to see him writing in this much detail about family, something he's never done before. I did a pretty extensive blog post about the magazine version when it came out because I happened to be in Japan when it was on the shelves and picked up a copy, so I'll post that link on the blog. I found a really interesting review from the Asahi that calls the writing Murakami tidying up and kind of making amends as he nears the end of his writing career or life. Rather than throwing out these memories, he's sharing them. It was translated and published in the New Yorker in September-October of 2019, so relatively quickly, and I think before this collected book version was published. I don't know if anything was added for the book version. I imagine it must have been fleshed out a little bit. It seems like it was a little bit longer than the magazine article. On June 4th, Murakami publishes a nonfiction collection called Murakami Tea, The T-Shirts I Love. The Japanese title is Murakami Tea, Boku no Aishita T-Shatsu Tachi. This is a collection of photographs of his T-shirt collection with little essays. It was serialized in Popeye starting from 2018. And the general consensus is that you have to love Murakami to enjoy this book. One Amazon review says, sometimes we indulge a writer we love. Yes, this is a vanity project. Fortunately for Murakami, he is one of the best writers working today, so it is easy to indulge him. And there are pleasures to be had here. I don't know why he would choose to translate this and not his other nonfiction from the 80s and 90s, his travel writing, for example. it would be, as a piece of writing, more literary and interesting. But there is a definite sense that Murakami from like the early 2000s onwards, or maybe even as early as Dance 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 onwards, so 1988, late 80s, early 90s, that he takes a certain pride in his consumer choices, and that part of his fiction is displaying those choices. And so it's natural that he would do that in his nonfiction as well. On July 18th, Murakami puts out a collection of short stories, first person singular, Ichininsho Tansu. These were serialized irregularly in Bungakukai from July 2018 to February 2020. Interestingly enough, the first three stories were all published in the same issue of Bungakukai, that July 2018 issue. Those were On a Stone Pillow, Cream, and Charlie Parker Plays Bossa Nova. There were another two in the next issue in August with the Beatles and the Yakult Swallows poetry collection. And then the other three came later. Carnival, Confessions of a Shinagawa Monkey, and then First Person Singular was special for the collection. Some of these went into English before they were in a collected edition. Cream and With the Beatles went into the New Yorker, and also Confessions of a Shinagawa Monkey. And then Charlie Parker Plays Bossa Nova went to Granta. Yeah, I haven't read this one actually, to be honest. I read Cream, which I think I read it. I read it actually in Japanese and when it was translated, and actually pretty good. It was an interesting little story. I thought pretty memorable. I read Confessions of a Shinagawa Monkey because I was very curious about it. It's a callback to Tokyo Kitanshu, so Strange Tales from Tokyo, that was in 2005. That was the story Shinagawa Monkey that was included in Blind Willow's Sleeping Woman, about a monkey who steals people's names, and now that monkey is in a different story confessing and is working at a hot springs or something. It reminded me a lot of Kunikida Doppo's Wasureenu Hitobito, Unforgettable People, but the really interesting story about a guy who stops at a hotel on a rainy night in Tokyo, outside on the outskirts of Tokyo, and this guy there, he gets into a conversation with a guy there, and he starts telling him about these people that he can't forget. And I don't know though. It's not one of Murakami's best stories, but it's another example of him kind of doing callbacks, riffing on ideas, things like that. Again, with this collection, Murakami writes a Kakioroshi story, a new story for the collection, with the title of the collection kind of bringing it all together, I think. And what I can kind of gather from these stories is that it's very similar to his normal themes, looking at the difficulty of connection, the illusory nature of reality. I'm curious about whether or not he tried to get other stories published in journals in translation, or if he just didn't want to go through that editing process and just wanted to put them all out in the collection. That's the other interesting note about this and Men Without Women, is that now we're starting to see Murakami in translation as we see him in Japanese. The order of the stories is slightly switched in English translation, but other than that, this is what you saw in Japanese. It's not an anthology collection like early in his career. It's not like Blind Willow's Sleeping Woman, which is somewhere in between. This is what's coming out in Japan, and we get it in the United States, or in English, pretty quickly after it gets published in Japanese. On August 27th, Murakami publishes a translation of The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers, Kokoro wa Kodoku na Karibito. Murakami finally gets around to this translation that he mentioned that he wanted to translate earlier. He uses the same title as the 1972 translation, and actually Shinchosha has a copy of his, I think, afterword or forward from the book on the website. I'll post a link to it, but it's really interesting. Murakami, in this piece of writing, says that this was on a list of works that he was saving in a quote-unquote vault of sorts to translate when he had better translation abilities. Those books were Great Gatsby, The Long Goodbye, Catcher in the Rye, Franny and Zoe, and Breakfast at Tiffany's. And then this was the last one that was left. He read it when he was 20, and it affected him tremendously. And the reason he saved this for last is that he wasn't confident about how it would be received by Japanese readers of this era, and he didn't have that same lack of confidence with the other works. On October 7th, Murakami publishes a translation of John Grisham's book Camino Island. The Japanese title will give away why Murakami is interested in this book, and that title is Great Gatsby o Oe. Literally translates to something like Go Get the Great Gatsby. This is a work of crime fiction from 2017. The plot is that someone steals F. Scott Fitzgerald's manuscripts from Princeton, and then there's a hunt for them. Murakami says that he randomly found this book while traveling in Poland and was obviously interested, couldn't put it down. He has an afterword, and I guess he notes that no lawyers are involved. So maybe Grisham's reputation is the same in Japan as it is in the US. And the only other thing that maybe noteworthy is that Murakami says he was able to see some of the Fitzgerald manuscripts when he visited Princeton in 1983. In 2021, Murakami publishes 2 books of nonfiction. This is also the year that the Waseda International House of Literature, the Haruki Murakami Library, opens. Will house his archives. It's pretty cool. I was able to visit last year. The architecture on the inside is done by Kengo Kuma, and the outside just kind of looks like a random administrative building at Waseda with a little bit of decorations on it. But the inside is very nice. They had timed entrances when I was going, so you only had about an hour there. There was a nice little cafe. There were some shelves of books that you could look through, a lot of really cool first editions, and a recreation of his studio at home, which has like his very cool speaker setup, his Apple computer where he writes. Worth a visit if you're in Tokyo and into Murakami. I would also try and combine it with seeing something around Waseda, even if it's just some really good ramen. I had some really good ramen there with like shrimp oil on top. Oh, I'll have to see if I can find that spot, and I put a link in the blog post because that was really good. But yeah, back to the books. June 24th, Murakami publishes Let's Talk About Real Translation, the expanded edition. Honto no Honnyaku no Hanashi o Shio. This is, I mentioned previously, I think it's just about the same with a little bit more material, but it's conversations between him and Shibata Motoyuki. The next day, on June 25th, he publishes Wonderful Old Classical Records, Furukute Suteki na Karashiku Rekodo Tachi. This is a set of photographs and essays on classical records, 486 of them apparently, and it sold really well from what I could see online. So well that not only did he do an extra additional kind of set for Brutus online, and I'll post a link to that, but he ends up, I think, the next year doing a sequel. This set doesn't seem to be serialized. It seems like something that might normally be serialized in something like Brutus or Popeye or a magazine like that on Consumer Style. But there's no information on Wikipedia about this yet, and I haven't flipped through it too closely at the bookstore. It seems similar to his book on translation and also the T-shirts book. The T-shirts in particular, because in that book title it's T-shirts Tachi and here Rekodo Tachi, so kind of humanizing, personifying these records and T-shirts as people a little bit with a Japanese title. I wouldn't be surprised to see this come into English translation, but I imagine there's less of a general audience than a book on his T-shirts. And now in 2002, we're nearing the end of this exercise, and Murakami has published 1 book of nonfiction and 2 translations. On February 16th, he publishes a translation of Philip Marlowe's Guide to Life by Raymond Chandler, Philippe Marlowe no Oshiru Ikikata. This is just a list of quotes by Philip Marlowe from Chandler's books that are listed by, associated by different vocab words, I think in alphabetical order. It was put together by Marty Asher, who is the editor-in-chief at Vintage Paperbacks. We know this because Murakami writes a long afterword that's included online. Murakami goes off on a long tangent about Asher, who was also a big fan of jazz, apparently, and was surprised that he quit so suddenly. They asked Murakami to add quotes that he liked to this book, but apparently Marty Asher's choices left no ground to cover, except that there were no quotes from The High Window and Playback. So he picked out some from those books, but otherwise it's exactly as it was in English. On April 7th, Murakami published a translation of The Last Tycoon by F. Scott Fitzgerald. The Japanese title is Saigo no Tycoon. It seems like he did a couple interviews before this translation got published, and from what I can gather, he wasn't impressed with this book when he first read it. I think possibly because it was unfinished, but also because it was so different from Gatsby. He says he calls it quiet compared to Gatsby, but he says he wanted to translate it because he feels like his translation ability has improved. And also, I feel like Murakami is just a completionist, so it makes sense that he would get to every last thing that F. Scott Fitzgerald has done. And on December 15th, Murakami published even more wonderful old classical records, Sarani Furukute Suteki Kurashiku Rekodo Tachi. So this is a sequel to this classical record book that came out in 2021 with even more recommendations. Although one thing I forgot to mention was that one thing I saw in comments was that a lot of these aren't records that are easy to find or that are available digitally. So it's kind of, I think you're kind of triangulating from his recommendations to find other things similar to it sometimes. And that's it. Murakami has not yet published anything in 2023 as far as I've been able to find. So this new novel, The City and Its Uncertain Walls, Machi to Sono Futashika na Kabe, we're just a few days away now, and that will be his first publication of 2023. So what have we learned from this 4.5 hour project that we just did? If you sat through all those, again, I will buy you a beer. Track me down somewhere, sometime. I will buy you a beer. What did we learn? We learned that Murakami plugged into the Japanese publishing industry almost immediately. He was off and running, within weeks, months after winning his award. He's translating F. Scott Fitzgerald. He's writing other short stories that go on to get published that next year. He's working on his next novel. He's working on a novella that he eventually recycles into a novel. We also learned that the connections he made early on and the things he published early on set a tone for the work that he would go on to do. He's always putting together short fiction in kind of focused sets that set a tone for the collection. After he finishes serializing but publishing in magazines, his first 3 novels, he's mostly publishing his novels straight into hardcover, but he's also experimenting with different types of publication. He's doing nonfiction serialization. He serializes the Wind Up Bird Chronicle over a course and of a year for the first book, then does 2 books and releases a 3rd book later on. He's putting out translations of a tremendous different set of writers, many of whom come from the U.S. and are kind of focused in that 1920 to 1970 golden age of short stories era. He's constantly writing something. He's publishing like a musician. He's putting out multiple editions of the same book, special covers, extra content, even if it's just a commentary or a tie-dye conversation. And we know that he's got regular collaborators, people that he's worked with for years and years and years, decades now, editors, writers, artists, and translators. We know that he has a special connection with his readers, that he doesn't like to do public readings and signings, but that he's found ways to interact with them online, and that it's gradually grown into an enormous audience where he's able to get tens of thousands of reader questions in 2 weeks. What's in the future for Murakami? I don't think we know. I think he's going to just continue doing what he's been doing, and some of that will be surprising, I think. I do think more of his work will be packaged for foreign readers as it is in Japan. I think we've seen that with his last couple of story collections, with his nonfiction book on T-shirts, and also just with his novels coming straight into English, not being abridged at all, not really being heavily edited like they were initially. Will he stop writing at some point, whether fiction or nonfiction or translating? I think that's unlikely. I think he'll probably write until he dies, or at least he'll keep translating until he can't like even move his fingers anymore. I feel like, because I think that's the only mode he has, to be honest. But will it be kind of like a Philip Roth type situation where, Philip Roth kind of decided to just stop writing fiction? And I don't know if he held to that. Maybe he came back or something. But I could see Murakami maybe stop writing fiction and then just focusing on translation or something like that. But that might also be surprising given how much focus Murakami puts on being a fiction writer. What kind of translations will he do? I think it's a good question. I think, he's showed us that he's expanding into other authors that are similar now that he's kind of exhausted a couple of his favorites. He's done everything from Chandler, Fitzgerald, Grace Paley, Raymond Carver, and maybe Elmore Leonard's a new one. Is he going to go back to that same era that he's interested in, 1920 to 1970? But again, he's been doing random one-off translations for his whole career. So I think he'll just kind of continue translating books that he randomly comes across, other books that are classics and that he thinks deserve a reissue or an update or something like that. And your guess is as good as mine. But we know what's coming up later this week. We know that it's probably going to be Hardball Wonderland, End of the World related. And I will get into more of that in the next episode. So I'll talk to you soon.